In my continuing series of Nintendo Fanboy reviews Sega Genesis games, I will be reviewing Vectorman 1. Released on October 24th, 1995, it was a markedly later release for the Genesis, especially at a time when it was not only still competing with the Super Nintendo, but also titles on the first Sony PlayStation. It was developed by Blue Sky Software, which did dissolve back in 2001 when its parent company Titus Interactive had financial problems. Blue Sky released a number of titles on Sega and other consoles, though notably none on any Nintendo systems. Some notable titles they'd published include the Genesis versions of Jurassic Park, Shadowrun, and sports titles like World Series Baseball. After the release of the first Vectorman, a sequel itself was released a year later, with plans for a third title on the Sega Saturn, though unfortunately that was cancelled. The story for Vectorman 1 is one that's similar to the movie WALL-E, to a point. Planet Earth has been destroyed due to pollution, and humanity has escaped to outer space while they have automatons clean up the planet until it, of course, is ready for them to return. Now imagine all the robots being orb bots, one of them having their programming being scrambled due to connecting to a nuclear warhead for some reason, it going rogue and becoming an overlord.
So dark! Do you sure you're not from the DC universe?
Personally for me, I think I've only heard of Vectorman in passing. I believe one of my buddies had it in their Sega Genesis collection, but honestly I don't ever recall seeing them play it. I do remember seeing some of the ads on TV, like this one.
Vectorman, play to win, October 24th. Sega.
The overall graphical style with the pre-rendered 3D graphics in a 2D offset is pretty similar to games from the Super Nintendo's Donkey Kong Country series. But honestly, I feel that the DKC series has done this so much better. Not only are the monkeys and characters themselves more detailed and better looking, they're more compelling overall than a series of interconnected spheroids. The environments themselves also have that 3D graphics-like look in the SNES DKC entries, whereas in Vectorman, all the backgrounds look like standard Genesis fare. That's not to say that they look bad, more on graphics later. I also feel like the overall gameplay is reminiscent to the SNES and Genesis Cool Spot games. Both Cool Spot and Vectorman feature characters that are actively trying to be cool, what with the sunglasses look, obviously heavier on that account for Cool Spot, as well as shooting indiscriminate projectiles at their enemies. The gameplay itself sees Vectorman firing with the A and B buttons, which can be done so in all 8 directions. The C button jumps, with Vectorman having the ability to double jump in the air. Fun fact, my first hour of playing the game, I didn't know he could double jump. Once I discovered this, I reset the game and started from scratch, and thus had a much easier time. This sort of reminded me of when I played Shinobi 3 on the Genesis on one of my earlier reviews, as I was continually discovering different abilities he had while playing the game. But really, missing out on a double jump?
Inconceivable.
There are a number of long falls that are in a lot of the 2D platforming type stages, which I think this is meant to take advantage of Vectorman's ability to slow down his fall by shooting rapidly below him. But since there's no turbo auto shot button, and since my controller I used didn't have one either, my finger got tired really quickly mashing the shoot buttons. And I noticed I had to do this often. Enemies are bullet sponges, necessitating some of the power-ups that are available to Vectorman. These can be obtained by destroying old CRT-looking TVs often hanging from the ceilings, and they include multipliers which increase Vectorman's strength via the number listed on the multiplicator, additional weapons that change his range and projectile spread for time, and things that will change his shape to like that of a top or a bomb, for example. I do wish one of the fire buttons was used to hold Vectorman in place so that he could fire with the other button in any direction that he chose. I mention this because while Vectorman can fire in all 8 directions, it also results in him moving in that direction as well. And it often directly put him in an enemy's path or out of range for hitting said enemy. Some of the placement of these enemies are in oblique angles that prevent Vectorman from hitting them consistently, taking forever to kill him. Or moving will be impeded because some of the flying enemies will spawn mid-air in spots that block Vectorman's path. While he does get a small frame of temporary invincibility after getting hit, he is also pushed back quite a ways that I feel it nearly negates the invincibility, as enemies can't just be passed through. And ultimately it necessitates enemies to be destroyed to be able to pass, and when they also have small hitboxes, annoyance levels can rise very quickly. While over half the stages themselves are the 2D platformers, there is some variation in the form of some overhead ones. These feature one single enemy to defeat, while also balancing avoiding various stage hazards. And I thought that they were a nice change of pace, and some of them looked really cool, like the bamboo stage. But they too can be quite difficult, and the game overall is as well. I feel though the difficulty that I had was due to fighting the overall mechanics of the game. If the invincibility frames were increased, kickback lessened when taking hits, as well as the relegated position held button implemented, I probably would have enjoyed the gameplay a lot more. Vectorman himself admittedly moves a bit quickly and slippery, the latter really being apparent on the Arctic Ridge ice stage. Still, I feel that may be due to the more speedy-based game style that's afforded to the Genesis overall, and when you've got a system that runs action in games at arcade levels, you take advantage of it whenever you can. To that end, I feel the 2D platforming levels themselves aren't as detailed, especially in comparison to the Donkey Kong Country series of games on the Super Nintendo. Yes, all the levels in Vectorman have different colors and lighting, along with different backgrounds, but what I noticed was that the actual platforms and whatnot that Vectorman traverses in the 2D levels kind of looked all the same. The overhead levels really help to break this up a bit, but these are relatively short since the level is completed once the primary enemy is defeated. Enemies are either mechanical, insectoid, or a mixed variation of both, and they look fine, really nothing that screams personality or fun like those in Gunstar Heroes and Earthworm Jim, but I guess they do the trick as cannon fodder as they were. The bosses, though, that appear are quite detailed, and honestly some of the best larger sprites I've seen on the Genesis. Vectorman itself is a product of its time, that 90s sort of, hey, I'm cool because I have attitude and wear sunglasses. Games also released in this era seem to have that sort of cool, funky techno vibe, and it does fit Vectorman overall quite well. Composer John Holland ended up creating what was ultimately my favorite thing with Vectorman. That's not to say the look and the gameplay itself are bad, it's just I found myself enjoying the music of the game the most as I went through each of the levels. Once again, I am pleasantly surprised to find yet another Sega Genesis game with a great soundtrack. This continues to debunk my preconceived Nintendo fanboy notions that just because the SNES had the better hardware for sound and music, the Genesis competes in its own way with some real banger soundtracks. Overall, I am giving Vectorman 1 a 7 out of 10 SNES controllers rating. While the music is great, levels colorful, and platforming action is good, I found a number of issues with the gameplay during my time. I hated not being able to fire in any direction at a standstill, the bullet sponge enemies, and lack of variety for the levels themselves, beyond the fantastic overhead ones. The game also can be unfairly hard due to placement of enemies, their small hitboxes, and the lack of health on harder difficulties. So that's my overall review for Vectorman. A couple notes on housekeeping. I know it's been a couple months since my last review in this series. Admittedly, Vectorman is a part of the reason for that, as I hit a bit of a YouTube content creator's block with this game, and it took me a while to really dive in and have fun with it. That's not going to be a problem with the next game I plan on doing in the series, which is Rocket Knight Adventures. The roughly 1 hour I played of it was a blast, and honestly it helped motivate me through Vectorman since I knew Rocket Knight will be what I'll be reviewing next. What's really cool too is that it'll be the 10th Sega Genesis game that I will have reviewed for this overall series. After I've completed with the review, I'll probably do another general update video on my overall thoughts about the 10 games I've played extensively and the series of these videos as a whole. Make sure you subscribe and ring that bell for notifications when these videos drop. If you liked or disliked what you saw, please make sure to do so, as well as drop me a line in the comments section below. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.